Detroit are owned by women. Now, to put that in context, 29% is the state average, 30% is the city average, and it hasn't always been 50%. It's grown as the formal economy has shrunk. The number of women-owned businesses has exploded. And so I just want to point out that these statistics, these numbers, really challenge the images and the stories that have been given to us in the media of either the young white male entrepreneur moving into the city and driving the revitalization. Notice young muscles pulling up the Detroit economy. And they also study this, these numbers challenge the second story that we're told, of older white men with their money bags coming into the city and buying up buildings and real estate and dealing with the blight problems. So again, I think the reality is that African American women have been and continue to be a main driver of Detroit's economy, and their role needs to be acknowledged and understood. So, and this is just a quick slide to show that they're in fact in some of the fastest growing sectors of the city, in healthcare and services. So they're not marginalized in these traditional sectors. They really are across the board. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go through all of the different, this is a part of a larger project on the informal economy in Detroit, and I'm just going to present a discussion of one industry in Detroit and some exploratory findings, so we can think about the role of these women in one industry. And so today I'll talk about the hair care industry, and I chose this because it's one of the most important industries for African American women in terms of historically, culturally, economically, politically, and socially. It represents both important oppression and opportunities. So, oh my gosh, let's start here. In terms of oppression, the whole industry develops out of the fact that black hair is this marker for racial inferiority. And so there's this need to make it conform and discipline it to meet mainstream expectations. And that really drives a lot of the early formation of the industry. And so, as scholars have suggested, it is the result of insidious and persistent gendered racism. At the same time, women have taken this and turned it into incredible opportunities. So the first African-American millionaire actually was created out of this industry, and it was a woman, C.J. Walker, which most of us should know, do know, hopefully. So this industry has really offered opportunities in terms of economic, a pathway to financial security, independence, and economic advancement for African-American women. But it's been a lot more than that. A lot of the women who've made money in this field have created important public spaces, both in the salons and also putting their money towards building boarding schools and theaters and gymnasiums and all kinds of important social spaces. They've played important political roles, so this industry has really been important in terms of creating opportunities. And there's been important work in the field which have shown how this industry has traditionally, and I'm going to focus only on the economic today. There's been great studies which show us how this industry has created a pathway to financial security for African American women. Specifically, it creates employment opportunities. There's 100 to 300,000 women African American women employed as stylists in the nation. There's at least 50,000 salon owners, so it creates these entrepreneurial opportunities. It offers middle class salaries, it's somewhere from zero to people report up to $100,000 a year. And as a result, it has offered African American women much better alternatives to the low-paying work or no work that they are given in the broader economy as they get pigeonholed into certain kinds of work. So also, the industry has developed alternative sources of support finance your business. So there's a whole alternative structure of support in this industry that developed. Now, I'm going to suggest that in Detroit, the story might be a little bit different. So certainly, this industry still represents that path for many women in many places. But I think in Detroit, this is becoming less and less true, and this is an important story that we need to look at. So I think there are a number of factors that come together at roughly the same time that have changed the nature of the industry. First of all, there's the rise of the natural hair care movement, which happens in the 80s and 90s, and I'm just running through quickly, you can ask me questions. You have the rise of the weave, which is hair extensions that can be used in the hairstyling. You have the beginning of immigration from Senegal, because there's an economic crisis there, restructuring of the economy, and the first waves of these immigrants come in, and they are all hair braiders. So they start this whole new sector of the hair care industry. And then you have changing regulation in the industry, which varies from state to state. But in Michigan, the Senegalese hair braiders are not licensed, don't have to get licensed. And then there's different kinds of regulations coming in for traditional salon owners. And then I think one of the most important explanations for what's happened in Detroit in this industry is decimation of the black middle class in the Detroit area. So really that was tied with the auto industry, and as the auto industry went down, these women, the next generation of women who go out to start salons, don't have access to those alternative sources of financial support to help them start their businesses. And so they're facing constraints that previous generations were not facing in terms of, and that's unique, I think, in this area, the way in which that occurs. So all of this converges and helps explain what I would suggest is a shift from the formal to informal, and the rise or the re-emergence, one might suggest, of the underground unlicensed kitchen salons that we see in Detroit. So this is just one example of the importance of understanding the local political context, the institutional configurations of industries and markets, which are gendered and racialized. So again, I think we need to rethink the informal economy and its role in Detroit, and we need to place women, and specifically African American women, at the center of our focus when looking at entrepreneurship and the economy in Detroit. And to do that, we need to have that understanding of the local economic and political context, again, in those institutional configurations, and look at the industries. So this is, again, some exploratory research of a much larger project. I'll stop here, and I thank you for your time.
Okay, a question or two for Sarah, and then maybe we can open for meta comments. Yes.
To what extent have you found that the internet, the rise of the internet, is expressing informal economic activity?
I have found that there's almost a U-curve. So you do have this older generation that's not on the internet, and that looks very different. And then you have the younger generation that's on the internet, and more specifically mobile phones, like not necessarily sitting at computers. So I think there is a U-curve in the role of the internet in terms of that generation. But that's all I can say at this point. I think that it does play an important role for the younger generation. But what that looks like, I'm not quite sure yet.
Yes.
Following that question, how are these places marketed, or how do people find out from your research about these kitchen salons and other?
I don't think that's changed, actually. I think it's always been word of mouth, and everybody, if you ask any person about their hair, they have the person they've gone to, and they usually find them from asking other friends who does a good job on it. So I think it's always been one of those industries, and it might be different for different industries, but for this industry, it's very much word of mouth and reputation that drives it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Swider, have you looked at the market from the perspective of the beauty supply stores, and the fact that when Madam C.J. Walker started the industry or hit the first hot phone, her main emphasis was to keep the actual product in the community as well, but African-American hairdressers have lost that connection, if you will, and it's come in the, it's become more of an Asian culture to sell the products to African-Americans.
Yeah, I don't look, I mean, there's been a lot of famous movies and press and all of that around this shift in the industry. I do think it undermines an important shift which has happened, which is the whole natural hair movement, which has moved away from a lot of products generally. And so I think, no, I'm not, I think people have looked at that and done that, and so I think that's another subset in the industry. One is selling the products, but I'm looking at the service of giving hair care and the way in which, that's been reconstituted.
The statistics says African American women receive much more education than the men. Does your findings predate that, or it's correlated to that?
I'm sorry, I'm not clear. What findings of mine predate the education of African American women? African American women have always dominated this industry. You mean their business ownership numbers?
Yeah, the fact that they're more likely to be educated than the male counterparts, if that's a recent phenomenon, or your findings hold true even before the educational differential between men and women?
And you know when that educational differentiate?
No.
No, okay. I'm not, then it's hard for me to answer the question if I don't know the dates of the
It's
education.
been fairly long-standing, and that's a proven fact. I think, were you asking me whether or not she found a correlation between that fact and her
Business ownership and education.
Yes.
Even without the educational differential, they'd be the same.
Actually, okay, so first, I haven't looked at that, so that's a good question. But also, this industry is an industry in which women have entered because they're closed off from, or traditionally women have entered it, maybe not now, but traditionally they have entered it because their alternatives were jobs that didn't require education. So even if they were getting education, the fields where they could use that education weren't necessarily open. So traditionally that's been the case. There's been studies which show and argue very convincingly that women have remained in this industry despite their levels of education, and remained as owners in this industry despite their levels of education, because of the opportunities it offers versus the alternative opportunities they have in terms of economic advancement. So I think if that answer to that question might vary across industries, that maybe the rise in education might have opened other doors, but I haven't looked specifically yet in that detail.
But that does raise my question that I was going to mention was, it seems like the African American man is still on the margins again, and because it's, as they say, the publicity about what's happening in Detroit is either about the young male, white male is coming in, taking over, or the rich white male is coming in, taking over. But it seems like the African American male, in terms of being out there, in terms of even publicity-wise or job-wise, it seems like it's out of the picture.
Right, I don't think they're out of the picture. I think there's great work being done on, for example, criminalization, and there's a new woman that just got hired at University of Michigan, and she came out of there and she was at Temple, who does a lot of work on the ways in which, the pathways of African American men. I can't speak to it, that's not my area of expertise, but I can say, that I think Black African American women have been marginalized and shouldn't be, because I think they are a central story here.
Okay, one more question for Sarah, then maybe more meta comments.
This is a question to first and third paper. And that has to do with the renegotiation of public and private spaces. We have the one example of Paris, which is a very different way in which public space and private space is negotiated by the state and by state agencies. and now through different sort of publics within the state. And then you have Sarah, which is really interesting because we know of barber shops as a kind of center within African American communities. It seems as if we now have a new sort of negotiations of public-private space within the household. The household being sort of the sort of quintessential private space, but now it's becoming a public space, both for economic generation, but also for the community itself. So I want you to talk about, do you see, Sarah, these hair salons are becoming sort of new semi-public or public spaces within communities to rebuild neighborhoods, and similarly in Paris. So there are different forces. You have the state kind of almost sort of removing the kind of neoliberalism that you talked about, which means that communities and neighborhoods are becoming self-responsible to recreate space, and how African American women through the salons are sort of recreating public spaces within sort of these domestic spheres.
Yeah, so very quickly, and then I'll hand it over to you. I want to do a shout out to Jenny, if you could stand up real quick, Jenny Lundgren. She's also working on this project. And she might want to chime in after I make a few comments on this topic, because I think this is one of the focuses that she's been looking at. But we have definitely seen in the neighborhoods we've been looking at, and we spent a lot of time actually in the neighborhood, in the streets, and that they are dominated by African American men, and the women are not to be seen unless it's 3:30 when the children are being picked up from school, and then they flood onto the streets like nobody's business. So but they are definitely been sort of pushed into private space. Preliminary research suggests we would think, my initial reaction was, oh, it's because it's dangerous and the crime levels. My interview suggests it's about reputation, about protecting your reputation. It's less about the crime, actually. In the day, it's not that they feel so dangerous, it's about their reputation. And also, in terms of the salon, yes, I think the salon has become, public space has been reconstituted in the private, and they've also, and this to me is very fascinating, that women are meeting in new spaces, like hair meetups and networking opportunities. And these are very political and social spaces, like 800 women getting together to talk about natural hair, but talking about everything else too. And so the ways in which the social and public space for them it is being reconstituted and reshaped in different interesting ways, I think. Jenny, I don't know if you want to add very quickly to that.
I don't necessarily have anything to add.
I can actually speak in a really direct way to this topic. Is that since the 2008 financial crash and then the 2010 European economic crisis, a lot of people in all over Europe, and particularly in the Paris area, have kind of fled into the informal economy. And in the neighborhoods I was speaking about, it's actually specifically Senegalese women, women from Mali, Burkina Faso, who are increasingly selling goods on streets, actually. And they're selling goods in these spaces that are defined very formally as a public space. And the French model to manage public spaces, or at least the Parisian model, has been this kind of classic one-size-fits-all strategy. And one of the things I talked about was the kind of movement of that from the movement of this shift from a one-size-fits-all strategy to some more of a neoliberal strategy, but that in some ways there's a recognition, I think, that, or maybe it's an inevitability that's recognized, this need to formalize the informal, which I was going to actually ask you about to see if there was any strategies for that at a meta level in the economy here. But in France, what's happening is that the municipal agencies are essentially trying to figure out ways to assimilate the informal into the formal with varying degrees of success, because I think they have no choice given the conditions around it.
Okay, I think we're out of time. I want to thank our panelists for 3 interesting talks. Thanks to the audience for your excellent questions. And I want to commend our speakers for grace under pressure.
Yeah.